Hi, I'm Sarah, and I better have a bit of a confession before I start. I'm a psychiatrist, just so people know. A few of you know that already. I'm also a mother. I've got lovely but feral children, and you know I love Newcastle, and I'm a big fan of Newcastle United. So that's sort of my confession over. My story really starts in sort of early childhood. I had a very difficult family. I was physically and emotionally abused by my father, facilitated by the rest of the family at times, and we still are a family, we still get on despite that. But obviously as a child that was quite difficult. This wasn't a Christian family, this wasn't a church-going family, but I found God. I found it bizarrely through my mum saying, well, you're a bit shy, I think Christians might be nice to you, go to a youth group. And so I went to a Christian youth group, and that's where I found God. So bizarrely, this non-Christian family turned me into a Christian, and because my dad, who was the sort of difficult member of the family, hated Christians, my rebellious streak, sort of it made me become more strongly Christian, which didn't really help the relationship we had or the abuse and everything else. But I moved on into a church, it's not a Church of England church, and this was in Yorkshire in the 1980s. So just when we're thinking about safeguarding, just put it back into the 1980s. This was a different time. So I was clearly seeking a family model that I could model myself on, and a new youth leader came with his family into the church and welcomed me into his family, supported me when I was sort of been up all night, when I'd been beaten up through the night and been wandering the streets. He let me sleep at his house, we stay, and obviously you can guess where this is headed. Obviously he exploited that situation, and I was sexually abused within that environment. And this went on for some time. There was a long period of grooming before that actually came about. Obviously, I felt that it was my fault. Everything had been my fault in my family. This was another thing that was my fault. But I did, when he left the church, I did report it. I did tell people in the church that it had happened, and the minister. But this was, as I said, the 1980s. He spoke to his church spoke to mine. It was a he said, she said. I was the vulnerable one who was probably being hysterical, and it was probably more about my dad than him, and he used my previous abuse against me as such. So that sort of went by the by, and I moved on to university and had quite a difficult time, but was well supported by Christian Union, my friends at Christian Union. Despite being a complete mess, I got through medical school, and then because life wasn't hard enough, I ended up working in Dunblane in 1996, which was when Dunblane had the incident had happened. So that was quite a baptism of fire, as we would say, into psychiatry. I moved on into psychiatry, and years went by, had family, everything else. What was missing was that acceptance and being valued by the church. I was a successful doctor, reasonably successful mother, hit and miss sometimes, being a mum. But they're still alive. They're still at school. It's a good start. So this was all going on, but I didn't feel valued by the church. And quite often, what was happening was the fact that I'd been a victim was being used against me. People were scared of me. People were sort of avoiding me being part of the church, almost silencing my voice in a sense. Looking back now, I see why. I see that it's, and I'll get onto that in a bit. I see why these reactions, and this is where Mark was talking about the healing of the whole church needs to happen, because it was quite often about what they felt rather than me itself. But obviously, when you've had a whole life of being blamed, being told you're the problem, this wasn't helping me in my church experience. So, I moved on, I carried on, I was still a doctor, I do all right, don't I? I've got colleagues in the room. I'm not a bad doctor. And then, there was a point where I was having a conversation with a friend who's sadly now deceased a few years ago, and just wondered where the abuser might be, knowing that, people move on and move around, and knowing nothing had happened, nothing legal had happened to him. So I wondered about it, and, since the 80s, we'd got the internet, hadn't we? So I could Google him. So we Googled him, me and my friend, two of my friends from my childhood, Googled him and found out he was a youth leader in a church that was an independent church. When we looked into that church, it had an affiliated organisation. There was no safeguarding in the church. There was no safeguarding in that organisation. They bought in their safeguarding from another, and So I thought, there's no way I can still report it to them. But me being me, when people need to be safe, and I do safeguarding. Safeguarding, as Anthony knows, safeguarding in addictions where I work is like bread and butter, isn't it? Every day we're dealing with safeguarding. So I just went down safeguarding mode, right, I need to do this. And fortunately, I stopped and thought, I need some support in this, and asked Ruth for a bit of help from, the safeguarding team here. And really, otherwise I think I could have completely fallen apart, because I sort of was doing my job, not remembering that I was the victim. I don't tend to see myself as a victim or a survivor. I tend to see myself as a thriver. And, and this was me going back to being more of a victim, and I didn't feel comfortable in that skin. So we reported it to the local authority, who put some actions in place. Everybody was brilliant. That's what I want to say about now. Everybody was so kind, so brilliant. Even from the first phone call to the police, they were absolutely brilliant, put me right through to the right person at the right time. So things have moved on from the 1980s. They got me involved with a non-recent abuse investigation team, who took it as far as they could, but it couldn't go to court. There's a marker on his name if he has an enhanced DBS. He wasn't allowed to be a youth leader in that church anymore, but unfortunately he's now a standalone CBT therapist, and he's his own boss, so he can do, there is no enhanced DBS checks he has to do. So, and this is something that is a flaw, I think, in the system, really. So that's sort of where I was. From this, I've been now involved in the Diocese Safeguarding Advisory Panel. I'm involved with Safe Spaces Steering Group. I'm involved in this project, and people are valuing me. So my time has come, in the church. I mean, I was not a fan of organised church back in the day. This is weird for me. Hearing my own voice booming around a cathedral is really quite strange for me. So this is something that is, I'm just glad to be here and being heard and valued. So I'm grateful. I know Mark's grateful for us, but we're also grateful for having this opportunity. So I'll move on a little bit to the project. The project really arose from us trying to figure out, in a sort of looking at how we respond well to survivors with myself and David. And we really were looking at how we could improve responses. And apparently I said, if I told you, what would you do, in a conversation we had. David's very good at remembering these things. I don't. These just come out of my mouth. I'm like they call me, I work in Veterans Health, and they call me permanent send. So, because it's just, and if you just, it's like, monkeys typing, eventually we'll get Shakespeare, So some things fall out of my mouth, David picks the good stuff up. And so we were looking really about the sort of why are there poor responses in the church. What was interesting when I reported things the second time to the police, it was the men that stood by me, not the women, which was, I think, brilliant for the men, but why did the women not? And I think it was the shame. They were mothers at the time. I was a child or a teenager. And I think it was something about the shame they held for standing by, facilitating, or just not seeing what was happening. And I think that's why we have bad responses. So and I think that is quite often, it's not about people being malicious, it's not about people intending harm, but by their own moral injury, the injury that's happened to them, for feeling betrayed by that individual, feeling groomed even by that individual, feeling that they should have done something or could have done something, or even feeling betrayed by the higher church. They really, this is holding them back from responding well. And I think this is where the whole healing of the church needs to happen. This is where we need to not just treat the individual, but by treating the whole church and healing the wounds of the whole church, then we can actually move things forward and heal the individual better and get better responses to the individual. So, I wholeheartedly agree with what Mark said about that. We sort of looked at the resources and we looked at sort of what we would want, what bad things, what good things had happened to us in our experiences, when we hadn't felt valued, all those sort of things, when we hadn't felt safe, had people responded well, had they not responded well. And we just came up with a cluster of sort of statements really about what we would want. If you can just move on to the next slide. So, and we clustered a lot of statements together that you will hear in the films, and then under those statements, they sort of seem to group into these sort of 7 points that you see on the left there. These sort of 7 points. Would you make me feel safe? Would you help me find others who understand and can offer me support? Would you walk with me at my pace? Would you show me that I can trust you? Would you encourage me to use my voice? Would you respect my choices? And would you value who I am right now? And I think sort of they're bookended by the making me feel safe, which feels a very practical thing, and there's a much more spiritual being valued, but actually they're two sides of the same coin. You can't, if you value someone, you want to make them safe, and by making them feel safe, you're valuing them, so it's bookended. But what is really interesting, going into my psychiatric role, quickly, but don't worry, I won't be too psychiatric, is they map very neatly, and not in a contrived way, they map very neatly onto the 6 principles of trauma-informed care. Obviously, we've got 7, but they do map very neatly onto this. So we knew we were on the right path, really, with this, that what we'd come up with independently and in a non-contrived way fell very much with the same sort of principles that are out there in trauma-informed care. So we felt very much that was something we were on the right track with. And so the films and all the resources sit with this, and Dave is going to talk to you a little bit more later about the sort of more theological elements of that. And there is a bit of an elephant in the room, or strawberry in the room, you might notice. I'll just tell you a little bit about the strawberry, because everybody's asking about the strawberry. Again, it was another thing that sort of came from a conversation with David and Carol. We came up with the emblem basically because David was having a sort of a moment of not feeling that he was very productive. And I was like, have a word with yourself, David. I got quite frustrated with David for not feeling very productive, because as you'll see, he is very productive. He's written some beautiful music, and he had already written that, I think, by that point, or was in the process of writing that. So this was a man who was very productive but couldn't see it. And what we sort of came up with was the emblem of the strawberry, because strawberries at all points are in the process of being productive. They can have leaves, they're photosynthesizing, going back to being a scientist. They can have flowers, they can have strawberries, they can have flowers and strawberries at the same time. They can have none, but they're still productive. They might be sending out runners and creating a new plant. They're very, very productive plants. And you can throw quite a lot at a strawberry plant, as I find on my allotment. That's another thing I'm fond of. And they seem to thrive, despite what you throw at them. But what I think is really important is they come out of muck. The more muck you put on them, the more they thrive. And I think that's something that I feel very strongly about. I'm thriving because of the muck that's happened to me, and I'm using it positively. It's not necessarily, it's a bad thing has happened, but can we make some good out of a bad thing? So that's really where the strawberry came from, for anyone who was wondering. Now I'll just move on to talking about my particular creative project. Obviously, a lot of people, I'm a woman of many words, as you can tell, and a lot of people, like I say, call me permanent send or various other phrases, not necessarily so polite. But some people can't relate to words. I actually relate, despite being a very wordy person, I relate better to images. And so we were looking very much at some other creative things that we could do. And I just happened to say, well, I do these prints, and I sort of do prints of birds, and I do prints of people, and I'm sort of trying to do angels at the minute. And so this is and I said, well, some of them are coming from some of the feelings that I've had. I did some angels when I was going through some therapy at one point, and, very much about how I was feeling. So, and I'd sort of envisaged this series of angels. And it was really looking at expressing the sort of recovery that, after traumatic experiences, but particularly church-related abuse. Obviously, angels are very spiritual phenomena, but they're also relatable to people who aren't Christian. People who aren't Christian can understand an angel. And, a lot of people talk about angels even if they have no faith. And I thought this is something that is relatable, because a lot of people who have been abused within the church are no longer within the church. And I think this is where this reach needs to reach beyond the church boundaries, because the people that really need the help are the people outside of the church, not necessarily within the church, but healing within the church is very important. And it's, but what I was thinking, going back to being a bit of a psychiatrist, I was thinking these phases of growth post, the phases you go through post trauma within the church or faith-based abuse, very much like the phases of grief. They can happen sequentially, or they can happen all at once, or they can happen and you feel like you've got somewhere and then you're back at the way, and or you can be going backwards and forwards through different phases. You can be angry one minute and then you can be feeling positive the next, and backwards and forwards. So I created these images of the sort of the journey I'd had through coming through this experience. And really, we can be experiencing a lot of them at any point, but ultimately it's about post-traumatic growth, as we would call it in the business. It's about getting to a point where you feel that you've got a restoration, you're no longer feeling shame or distress. And I'll just go on to the next slide. So we start here with the images of being overwhelmed, fearful and despair. This is quite often the early stages of after trauma, but we can be stuck in this forevermore. We can go back to this at any point, and we can quite often these images obviously sort of describe that first phase, and then move on again. And then clearly we're holding shame, as Mark spoke about. We're holding shame that isn't ours to own, and I think that's a really important thing. We feel shameful. Our perpetrators have made us feel the shame. They've made us feel shameful. That's how they've got a hold on us. And it's that I think, despite coping with all the other things that happen in abuse, that's the thing that quite often is the hardest to deal with, and the thing that lasts the longest. It was the thing that was the last thing to change for me, was dealing with the shame that I'd held, that sort of, that I hadn't maybe, the police hadn't got involved. Even that, which I felt ashamed of. Why hadn't I got the police involved in the 1980s? I know the police wouldn't have got involved in the 1980s. I know that I was only a child in the 1980s, those sort of things. But the shame is there. He made me feel that I was tempting him. I was the wrong person. So we're holding shame for a long time, and that can stop our relationship with God. It can stop us coming forward as well. And but once you get past shame and betrayal, particularly betrayal from the wider church, that sense of betrayal from the higher powers, the sort of moral injury is betrayal. But it's only then when you get past those to being actually angry about the situation, about outraged, and like, this should not be happening. I should not be feeling shame. I should not be feeling betrayed. I should not be being betrayed. I need to do something about it. I like outrage. The angel gets a sword, I know, and we've just been taught, and I like swords. So, and then suddenly the power shift is within the person. We are starting to get the power back. And if you just move on to the next set. And then once you've got through that outrage, you start restoring justice and trust. You get justice, whether that's justice in a criminal sense, or whether that's justice by being accepted, your voice being heard and believed. I think being believed is the biggest justice I've had. And, when I phoned the police, they didn't doubt me. They didn't doubt, they just asked why now. I told them why now, because I want to make people safe, and they accepted that, and it moved on. That was enough for me. And then you restore trust, and if you move on to the next one, we get dignity back. With this growth, we get dignity back, and ultimately we're honoured, and we feel honour, and we feel honoured, and we can be useful to people. But you can feel all these things at the same time, and you can progress through these sequentially. So this is where the sort of art the artwork sort of as depicting this sort of post-traumatic growth. And it's a message of hope. It's a message that you can get through this. I don't think everybody wants to be me. I sometimes don't want to be me, but you can be like me and get through this and be heard and be respected and be standing in the cathedral saying things that, when you never thought you'd even walk into a church again. So that's me.